Welcome to the NAEA presentation. There's a pandemic going on. Data visualization as critical place-based art education in challenging times. I'd like to introduce our presenters here today. That would be me, Joy Bertling, Assistant Professor at the University of Tennessee, Lynn Hodge, Department Head of our Department of Theory and Practice in Teacher Education and Professor of Math Education at the University of Tennessee, and Erica Ryba, Art Teacher at Coulter Grove Intermediate School in Maryville, Tennessee.
With the emergence of COVID-19, public interest in data visualization surged. In the early days of the pandemic, data visualizations such as flatten the curve graphics and social distancing animations quickly shaped United States discourse. Soon, health departments and news organizations had set up daily data dashboards, and all sorts of COVID-related data visualizations proliferated on the web. Since early 2020, data visualizations have fulfilled many functions. They have assisted the public in assessing risk. COVID-19 infection rate graphs have allowed community members to make informed decisions about many aspects of their lives, such as when to schedule a doctor's appointment or go to the grocery store. They provided comfort and hope, while data visualizations likely provided some security by helping individuals make sense of large and sometimes overwhelming data sets. The content of these visualizations sometimes engendered hope. Joy thinks back to a New York Times graph offering vaccine eligibility projections, and I remember seeing data from countries able to contain the virus early, like New Zealand and Taiwan. They memorialized those who were lost and offered a means to process grief. Across the globe, people have attempted to mark the impact of COVID-19 in different ways. Felt roses, paper cranes, paper hearts, and quilt squares, with each item signifying a life lost. In addition to serving these different functions, data visualizations also importantly raise questions related to the data and the social context in which the data occurred. Extending beyond, but remaining connected to COVID-19. This context involved the racial and social inequality and economic disparities brought to the fore and at the same time deepened by the pandemic. For instance, with high employment and school closures, concern arose surrounding how social distancing might negatively impact mental health in women caregivers' careers and might contribute to increased domestic violence, food insecurity, and childhood poverty. Additionally, many high-profile events of police brutality against Black Americans and white anti-Asian violence continued to incite alarm and protests. Climate change, rather than being ignored during the crisis, as many had assumed, became a more prominent concern for people in many countries. Within this context of heightened public social and environmental consciousness and extensive creation and consumption of vital data visualizations, we recognize the role that data visualization might play in expanding social and environmental awareness and engagement. In this way, the context of the pandemic propelled us to a place to reconsider how art education more broadly and data visualization more specifically can engage students in issues that matter to them. We pose the following questions. How might art education empower students to engage with the issues directly affecting them and their communities? How might data visualization play a central role in these endeavors? In the latter months of 2020, as the COVID-19 pandemic approached its peak in the US, these questions informed a data visualization curriculum unit we developed and implemented in an intermediate school art classroom.
Data visualization can involve the representation of any form of data, but for the purposes of this presentation, we like to focus on data visualization's potential for showing quantitative or statistical information. Like data visualization in general, statistical visualizations can vary widely from conventional graphs and STEM fields to interactive sensory installations in contemporary art. So in defining data visualization, we embrace divergent approaches, such as those that use pictorial or sculptural elements, sound, movement, or audience interactions to present information or to represent information. Thus, we are expanding the definition of data visualization beyond graphical representations. At the same time, we adhere to the tenet that data visualization should be tied or tethered to the data. Specific aspects of data visualization should still represent a single statistic or trends, patterns, or other characteristics of a collection of data in some way. Within the realm of contemporary art, these data points or patterns, when represented through data visualizations, often raise meaningful, compelling questions. The critical questions that data visualizations are capable of raising can be especially poignant when they intersect with students' lived experiences. Engagement with local data is one way in which data visualization might be particularly relevant to students. When the data students visualize is local, either accessed through local databases or collected by students, data visualization might function as critical place-based learning. Place-based education is a form of education dedicated to supporting students' place consciousness by situating educational experiences within local geographic and sociocultural environments. Moreover, a critical pedagogy of place focuses on social change and environmental responsibility through an activist transformative orientation. Over the past 3 decades, art education scholars have explored how place-based pedagogies might inform art education. For instance, I discussed how even in the midst of cultural and educational experiences that often can incite feelings of disembodiment and dislocation, the arts might facilitate students' greater awareness and connection to place. And Mark Graham outlined methodologies for art education informed by a critical pedagogy of place to include cultural journalism and transformative education. While critical place-based art education holds many promises for art education and could align with data visualization activities, this article also explores how the constraints of schooling, particularly when intensified by a pandemic, might shape learning.
We are presenting the case of a data visualization instructional unit we designed and implemented into 6th grade art classes in suburban East Tennessee, Appalachia. This unit was intended to empower students to engage with important issues in their communities through single statistic visualization. We define single statistic visualization as the visual representation of one statistic that summarizes a data set associated with locally relevant social or environmental issues. Teaching during the COVID-19 pandemic presented additional challenges, including once-a-week classes further reduced by quarantines and virtual learning, limited opportunities to engage with the community, and a political atmosphere that impacted students' approach. Next slide. Before we familiarize students with socially and ecologically oriented data visualization, we wanted to set a foundation by introducing them to the idea of art as activism. After asking students what is activism, we discussed recent social and environmental movements, such as Black Lives Matter rallies and Greta Thunberg. We then looked at ways in which art could function as activism. Next, we helped students define data as information data visualization as showing information, and statistic as a fact or piece of information in number format. Next slide. To introduce the artistic and socially impactful possibilities of data visualization and expand perceptions of data visualization beyond the charts and graphs students had previously encountered in their math and science classes, we examined a number of distinctive data visualizations. First, we looked at this image that showed 1,600 papier-mâché pandas. Each panda represented one giant panda left in the wild. This was installed in urban locations around the world. Next slide. Next, we looked at a simple machine that releases a penny when its crank is turned for 4.97 seconds, the equivalent of a $7.25 per hour minimum wage. Next slide. Lastly, we looked at this dessert tray image with a number of pomegranate seeds on the cake corresponding to the number of women killed in France as a result of domestic violence. By engaging students with visualizations from locations around the globe, we missed an opportunity to expose students to local art. Global images were easier to access as we were unable to locate local place-based examples. These global issues inspire students to investigate similar issues in Tennessee, such as domestic violence, and prevented the temptation to replicate these works. In addition, each of these examples included single statistic visualizations that students deciphered with the aid of a worksheet. We specifically chose single statistic visuals as a way to direct students' focus and attention due to time constraints and to show a variety of visual approaches to help students brainstorm. Next slide.
We wanted students to select a local statistic of social or environmental relevance to them. But to do this, they needed time to investigate issues and find these statistics. Given the time restrictions that we outlined earlier, we were only able to allocate half a class period to this process, which we considered a serious limitation to the in-depth place-based research we had originally anticipated. To contend with this time constraint, we asked students to work in groups and gave them a list of social and environmental issues with links to local statistics and accessible databases, although students were free to choose beyond the issues listed. While I sensed a few students were initially resistant to the idea of exploring social and environmental issues due to political reasons, by the end of this activity, all students seemed to have identified a few issues they felt comfortable tackling. After conducting this research, each group of 3 to 4 students settled on a local socially or environmentally oriented statistic to visualize, although a few groups insisted on national or global statistics. Groups who had not identified a statistic within this time frame were given a handout with 10 local statistics from which they might choose. And several groups did need to choose from this list. The topics students chose included air pollution, opioid abuse, deforestation, forest fires, divorce, childhood poverty, homelessness, traffic fatalities, and overpopulation, though COVID-19 was the most popular. In many cases, students chose familiar issues deeply impacting their lives. As one student in a group that depicted COVID-19 cases exclaimed, "There's a pandemic going on." And another student spoke about the impact of divorce on children while alluding to her own experiences with that. Other students learned about an issue for the first time, such as opioid abuse. as you can see here, which is a student data visualization of the number of opioid deaths in 2016 in the county in which they lived. And each pill represents one death. Even among the students familiar with their issue previously, many expressed astonishment in learning how high the frequency or percentage was locally. In this way, they began to enter into critical place-based learning. Students appeared to be considering the context of the people and places wrapped up in the data. Thus, they viewed the data in a three-dimensional sense rather than just numbers to be reported. Engaging in this way, students can begin to consider issues of equity and access behind the data. Scholars have noted the importance of students talking through the history of data and the manner in which data are collected and analyzed. However, more recently, scholars have argued the need for discourse that highlights the personal human aspects of data to foreground inequities and experiences embedded in data. Researching how these topics show up locally and examining data that mattered to them allows students opportunities to develop this kind of discourse around data and position data as potentially personal and involving human experience.
As part of the planning process in creating data visualizations, students worked in groups to prepare sketches and conference with us to determine various supplies needed to complete their data visualizations. Group size fluctuated by week due to quarantine measures. Each group completed data visualization within 2 to 3 class periods despite this. And all groups, except for one, included 3-dimensional elements. They were given their choice whether to do 2D or 3D. Also, all groups used imagery to provide some context for their statistic. Next slide. As stated, all groups used imagery to provide context, picking symbols commonly associated with their topics. In the figure on the left, one group created one headstone to symbolize each COVID-19 death. On the right, this image shows how one group constructed industrial smokestacks under a polluted sky to demonstrate industry's contribution to local air pollution. In this way, their visualizations brought statistics to life so that they become more tangible and thus more meaningful and impactful. In this example, expected symbols introduced new layers of meaning to common narratives surrounding the statistic. In this student data visualization, the number of acres burned in the 2016 Smoky Mountain wildfires, each bone symbolizes 1,000 acres. In visualizing their statistic, a few groups chose unexpected contexts and symbols far removed from their audience's likely associations. Next slide, please. For instance, one group used a birthday cake scene to symbolize deforestation, and several groups used video game scenes and characters to contextualize COVID-19 statistics. Students in this cake example explain people like cake. As viewers realized the sprinkles represented the burnt acres, students hoped that the viewers' feelings would change. Such novel, multi-layered approaches to data visualization, incorporating the elements of surprise, hold promise for inspiring audience interest, learning, and engagement.
While we see exciting potential in students' divergent contextualizations as educators, we also want to encourage students adopting these approaches to consider their intended effect. Empathy will likely be required from students in these cases, although we believe it can be cultivated. For instance, the group portraying COVID-19 deaths within video game contexts seemed to do so to emphasize the danger inherent to contracting the virus, positioning it as the monster or villain. However, when we questioned them about how viewers might feel seeing their deceased loved ones portrayed as video game victims, They seem to struggle to comprehend how their data visualization might be perceived as insensitive or as trivializing a serious situation. By posing regular reflective prompts, including ones that ask them to justify their artistic choices, teachers might encourage students to consider audience perceptions. At the conclusion of the prematurely shortened unit, groups briefly shared their statistic with the class and explained how they visualized it. Through these presentations, students were exposed to additional approaches to data visualization and gained further knowledge of their community. While students took the first steps toward critical place-based learning and engaging with community issues, the natural step of sharing their learning beyond the classroom and engaging the community directly was halted, although a few groups had the opportunity to display their works in the hallways. While this cessation might be understandable, given the extreme circumstances under which we were all working, we also see how it might also be indicative of the challenges school-based art educators often experience in taking critical place-based art curriculum to this next phase of community-oriented action. Additional class time and teacher planning are required, not to mention the teacher's efforts sometimes necessary to justify these approaches to stakeholders. While these challenges can be significant, we have personally seen in pre-pandemic days how powerful these approaches can be. Many of the challenges we experienced, severely limited class time and confinement to the classroom, were realities for many art teachers prior to the pandemic and will exist after the pandemic. They are simply amplified due to COVID-19. While as art educators, we can advocate for change, such as more class time with students, seeing middle school students daily instead of weekly, access to outdoor spaces and infrastructure to facilitate field trips, we can also recognize the potential of critical place-based data visualization projects, even given the existence of these types of restrictions. This project highlighted the power of art in rehumanizing data. Art created access to human experiences, and sometimes more than human experiences, wrapped up in statistics and supported discourse that treated the data reflecting people, plants, and environments as worthy of attention. Importantly, this enhanced understanding can fuel the conversations needed to support individual agency related to data and potential responses to inequities. If art can do this for quantitative data, what other aspects of human and more than human experience can it uncover and illuminate?
Thanks, Lynn and Erica. And so we have our references here, and I just wanted to provide our contact information. Mine is jbertling at utk.edu. Lynn Hodge is lhodge4 at utk.edu, and Erica is erica.ryba at maryvilleschools.org. And so we've been happy to present this account of our work in schools and data visualization with you today, and wish that we had the opportunity to have, discussions, but Erica and I will be attending the conference in person, and hopefully some of you can make it there and we'll be able to engage with this further. But thank you very much.